Welcome to AlexGs Aquarium, everybody. Today I am going to be talking about algae control in my aquarium system because it's a pretty relevant topic because there's a lot of hair algae in the aquarium system right now. And pretty much every post I make on social media at this point, someone comments on the algae or has a suggestion for how I should get rid of the algae. So I thought this is the perfect opportunity to talk about what I do to take care of algae in my aquarium systems and how I deal with hair algae outbreaks like this. Today's video, I'm going to go through the aquarium system, talk about where the algae is located, then I want to talk a bit about the root cause of why the algae is here based on my experience in this hobby. Then I'm going to go through mitigation steps on how I control algae in my aquarium systems. So starting in the 4200 gallon aquarium, the majority of the algae is in the fish only section of the tank. It's about 90% coverage with hair algae right now. There's a few spots that are starting to clear up, and I can see the algae, it looks like it is gotten to its peak and is starting that decline, but there's a long ways to go to get to that point in the fish only part of the display. Just on the other side of the divider in the display, the reef tank though is only got about 10% hair algae coverage in there. For the most part, it's kind of just slowly going away and not really coming back in too many places. There's a very interesting contrast between the two sides of the display. Moving into the fish room, the 400 gallon coral tank in the back has got some hair algae on the side walls, the back wall, and a little bit in the aquascape, not too much. I could see a little bit has been popping up a little bit more though. And in this tank, I also have a basket in here that's got some chaetomorpha and some red macroalgae in it. The 150 gallon in the fish room, it's just got a touch of hair algae right now. And this tank has got some new residents which are always very hungry. So I would suspect with the increased nutrients, this might change over time and increase that hair algae. And finally, in the fish room, I've got the 700 gallon refugium tank, which is where I intend to grow a lot of algae, but there's not that much there right now. There's some hair algae that's growing in there and a floating mat. There's also a bunch of chaetomorpha, some caulerpa, and some red macroalgae growing in here. Now that we know where the algae is located in the aquarium system, the next thing I want to talk about is why is the algae here? Now this is all based on my experience in the hobby, things I've learned that have helped me deal with algae, which is understanding what the likely root cause of the algae is in the first place. And in this case, I'm going through what they call the uglies. This is a new aquarium system, and there's a lot of imbalance and balancing that needs to take place. And why is that? Now first off, the aquariums in the fish room have been operating for about 3 years. And they had a metal issue for about 2 of those years, which has since been cleaned up. But that system was very much established. Didn't really have any algae control issues going on in it. But then we have the 4200 gallon display. Now this tank has only been running for 7 months. And the first few months this tank was up and running, it was standalone and not connected to the fish room system. And really focusing in on what happened in the 4200 gallon display is important for my root cause of why I have all this hair algae. The 4200 gallon display was started with 3,000 pounds of dry rock, another 500 pounds of dry sand. So when this aquarium was filled up with salt water and heated, there was no life in it. There was no microbiome in here. So I went ahead and I dumped in about 30 pounds of live sand, about 30 pounds of live rock in here from the running fish room system. But that just was to try and jumpstart life and get it inoculated. For the first couple months, this aquarium was also on its own system as I did water changes in my little 25 gallon tank, and I would suck out the detritus and algae and have just this dark looking bucket of stuff that normally I would dump down the drain. I was actually walking over to the 4200 gallon tank and just dumping it in. And the reason for that is I'm trying to inoculate this tank with life. By adding it in there, I see bacteria, microfauna, macrofauna, algae, all that stuff gets into the tank. But this is a blank canvas. So what happens? Well, if there's nothing there to start, the life is going to compete for a space to survive. So you're going to have competition. You also have to understand the environmental factors that are available. Half the tank got lit up with lights at the beginning, and that provides a source for photosynthesis. And then you have all these different organisms floating around in the water. They start to establish on the rocks, and they have a food source in the form of some kind of nutrients. Well, they're going to start to grow. And this 4,200 gallon display went through a lot of different phases to get to where it is now. First, when it got started, there was a big diatom bloom, then the diatoms died off, and then cyanobacteria came in, and then the cyano mostly went away, and hair algae, red cotton candy algae, ulva, caulerpa, film algae, and even a little bit of coralline algae started to grow throughout the tank where it was lit. As that happened, the hair algae eventually just outcompeted everything else and started taking over. It can grow really fast, use the available nutrients in the water, and just continue to take over. And as I added more light to the tank, the population of hair algae in here just exploded to where it was covering most of the reef tank for a while. The fish only section didn't have too much in it. It was actually not looking bad, but then the hair algae started to decline in the reef tank. Then it started to grow more in the fish only section. The tanks in the back were having some fluctuations in hair algae levels. The refugium started growing more algae all of a sudden. So there's a lot of change happening in this system in a very short amount of time. So knowing all this, how do you deal with it? Now for me, it's about time, patience, and targeted mitigation steps for algae control. I don't expect the algae to balance out in here and get this system where I want it until at least 2025. And it might go into 2025 a bit because it's just been an enormous amount of change in the system. And it's okay, it's something I expected, and that's why giving it the time and being patient with it with targeted mitigation is going to resolve this problem and get the system where I want it to be. The targeted mitigation comes down to a few things: invertebrate cleanup crews, fish that eat algae, and then the steps that you can take as an aquarist to help steer the aquarium system where you want it to go. I will tell you though, what it is not is a magic bottle that is going to remove the algae from your tank. I don't recommend products that kill algae or doing treatments that'll get rid of it. As an example, somebody said I should pull all the aquascape out of the 4,200 gallon display, dip it in hydrogen peroxide to kill the algae, and then put it back. There's over 3,000 pounds of rock in here that are cemented together, and it took me weeks to plan and assemble with the tank empty. I couldn't even imagine trying to do that when it's full. Not to mention the fact that while something like that might kill the algae, it's probably going to kill a lot of the bacteria, microfauna, and macrofauna that I have on there that I want, because they're valuable to essentially turn this dry rock into live rock. So that's not going to be the solution. A chemical you dump in that kills the algae isn't going to get rid of the root cause, which in this case we know life is competing and trying to find its way, and it has nutrients available. Simply killing the algae isn't going to solve that problem. In fact, the algae can simply re-release all those nutrients back in the water, and you're kind of starting at square one again. If you take a chemical that kills algae, dump it into your reef tank, it might kill the algae, and this is the question I have because I'm not a chemist or a biologist. What is it doing to the symbiotic algae in my photosynthetic corals? I don't know. Could it have harmful effects on other organisms in here? I don't know. Therefore, I don't use those products and I don't recommend them. Matter of fact, the closest thing I've used to that is red slime remover, and that's an antibiotic treatment to kill cyanobacteria. And I haven't used that stuff for over 8 years because the last time I did in my 1600-gallon system, I isolated one tank and treated it because it was really bad in there. But after I tied it back into the system, some of it came back anyway. So it didn't solve the root cause of the problem, which is what I'm trying to do when I control algae. So therefore, I don't do that stuff anymore. So let's move over to mitigation steps, starting with invertebrate cleanup crews. My go-tos here are snails and sea urchins. And I've listed some different species on the screen here for ones that I like, and I kind of ranked them from most voracious algae eater to least. And this is purely my opinion and my observations over the years. And some of them I put on an equal playing field. And with both cases, with snails and sea urchins, take it slow. I didn't dump hundreds of snails and dozens of urchins into this tank in one day. I started with 12 snails, and then I added 2 sea urchins. And as the algae started to increase in population, I started to add more. If you dump a bunch of inverts in that eat algae, and there's no algae, they could starve to death and die, release more nutrients in the tank, which in turn could make your algae problem even worse. So take your time with it and realize if there's available nutrients in the tank and that there's no competition or significant predation, something like hair algae, it's going to explode in its population and go way beyond what your cleanup crew can handle. And I'm talking a properly sized cleanup crew, because if you try to scale it up to the worst of the worst with the algae, when that algae dies back, you're going to have excess cleanup crew that again could starve to death because they just don't have enough food. There's a couple other invertebrates I want to mention. Hermit crabs for one. There's some in my system, but I don't consider them the most voracious algae eaters. They'll eat some. I think they might kill more snails than they actually eat algae though. So I have some, but really I'm not adding a lot of hermit crabs. The other one I wanted to mention is sea hares. Now, I've kept sea hares one time in my last system when it was going through the uglies to try them out. And one of them got sucked into a power head and died. The other one just died long before any of the hair algae was gone. Supposedly can release toxins into a tank if they die or get stressed. As far as I know, that didn't happen to me, but while they're good algae eaters, I just was like, it just didn't work for me, and I'm not interested in trying them again, especially if they got to be supplementary fed or you're going to have to try and rehome them. And I know there's a lot of other inverts you can use for cleanup crews. I'm specifically looking at stuff that just eats algae though, there's a whole lot of scavengers and stuff that are good to have too. And there's other algae eaters that I didn't mention in here because I don't have the experience with them. Moving over to fish that eat algae or herbivores, there's a bunch of different species I put on screen here. Again, I ranked them in my experience from the most voracious algae eaters to the least. Some of them are all kind of in the same. The one thing I'll say with fish is, one, make sure you have the appropriately sized tank for these fish. Some of them do get very large. My opinion with fish is they can definitely help a lot. Foxface and rabbitfish by far I think are the best algae eaters for things like hair algae, but they can never keep up with it all the way. My poor foxface in the fish only tank right now is basically stuck in the endless all-you-can-eat buffet, and he probably needs to stop eating because he's always eating hair algae all day long. But in either case, the fish will help, but they're generally not going to be able to tackle it on their own. I generally look at fish as being more of a maintenance piece of your cleanup crew after you kind of get past the root cause of a system having a lot of algae. Fish help to maintain so that it doesn't get out of control, so it's more of a balance piece for me. So now that we've gone through invertebrates and fish, the next thing is, what can you as the aquarist do to help resolve algae issues? Well, the first thing that I like to do is manual removal of algae. And in this case, with the hair algae in my system, cleaning the screen on the overflow box, doing that multiple times a week. Cleaning my flow pumps, which suck in lots of hair algae and get clogged up. Those are really simple ways you could start with to pull hair algae out of a tank, and it's direct export. Whatever grew that algae and it's still in algae form and you pull it out, you just exported the nutrients that were used to grow it. Beyond that, for manual removal, if you have glass or acrylic, you could scrape it off, and I recommend siphoning it off or netting it out right away if you can. You don't want it to be floating around in there and break up, and then you'll just re-release nutrients and come back. As far as hair algae removal from the rocks though, that's a little bit of a different story. If the hair algae is holding onto the rocks really tight and it's not coming off, just leave it. That's my advice there. What you want to wait for is the hair algae to start to get a whitish or gray color on the bottom. You'll see it start to lift off the rocks. It'll get real long and stringy. Sometimes it'll kind of form into little branches or balls, and it'll be sitting there. That's the time that you want to try to pull the algae out. And there's a few different ways that I like to do this. One, I got my tongs. I'll go in and I'll just grab that cluster of algae and pull it off. That has been working great in the reef tank where most of the algae is gone, so I'm just trying to remove these little tufts here and there. So that's been very effective for removing that type of algae. The other thing, if you got large swaths of it like I do in the fish only tank here, is you siphon it out, and you could do that, just it'll suck it right off the rocks if it's loose and letting go. Again, if it's holding on tight, I'd just leave it there. You can brush it off, and a little bit of the footage I'm showing, I had a brush. I was really trying to see though if I could just encourage it to come off easily. I generally don't do brushing in my systems anymore, because if you brush it off the rocks, yeah, you'll clean the rocks up, but you're just grinding that algae into fine particles and floating it around the tank. Now, if you're doing a water change or you put some micron filters or something in, it might be something that'll work for you. That just doesn't really work for me though anymore. So I just wait for it to come off the rocks, and when it is, you definitely want to go after it, because if it does come off the rocks, if it just settles somewhere and starts to just rot away, it's again just releasing those nutrients back in. So with them being locked up into the algae is a good time to remove them manually. You can also do this in conjunction with a water change. Water changes, you can't go wrong with exporting with a water change. It's a great way to clear those nutrients out of the tank that are feeding the algae. Another thing is cleaning your protein skimmer more often, turning it up so it pulls more out of the water, just pulling organics out before they become available to the algae. And then granulated activated carbon is another good one that I like to use, and I just simply put it in some mesh bags and toss it in the sump. I don't use reactors for it, and that can also absorb some things out of the water. The last thing I wanted to talk about was use of a refugium for algae control. And this can be a very interesting topic to discuss with people, because often people hear the word refugium and think of a lot of different things. So let me define how I see a refugium. A refugium is a place in your aquarium system where microfauna, macrofauna, and algae can grow with little to no predation. That's how I define a refugium. So how do I use it for algae control? As my tank gets established and all this rock in, the display starts to get through benthic succession, things like coralline algae and other calcareous algae take over, the hair algae isn't coming back in those places. But there might still be enough nutrients for that stuff to try and grow and be in little patches around the system. There could also be other algae that try to grow. So for me, I use the refugium to create that zone in the tank to just let the algae that's going to grow with the nutrients available grow. And I'll put macroalgae in there, chaeto in there, caulerpas in there, and I'll let hair algae, cyano, all that stuff is just free to grow how it wants to in that tank. And really the idea behind it is, if it's going to grow, let it grow there. And so I'll increase my intensity of lighting. I'll adjust the time of light as well. I run lights over my refugium over 16 hours a day, usually about 12 hours for each fixture running. And I recently just put Radion XR15, that's a freshwater version, over my refugium just to increase the light intensity over it to encourage more algae to grow. Now, I don't supplement the algae at all. That's something I don't do. Is there's no extra supplements going in there. The only thing that happens in my refugiums is the affluent of my calcium reactor goes in there, and the idea behind that is really so that any excess CO2 in that affluent that's coming out becomes available to the algae. And I'm sure some of the other elements that are coming out in that affluent too are going to get soaked up by some of the algae, but I did it in my last system. I don't expect the algae growth in that refugium to be an explosive growth all the time. When my 1600-gallon system was at its best, the algae growth in the refugium had slowed down pretty significantly to where it was a steady growth, but it wasn't like I have to clear this thing out every week because it's overgrown. So that's something else, is trying to find that nutrient balance, and that's how I like to use a refugium to help control algae, because in conjunction with your invertebrate cleanup crew and your herbivorous fish, that will help keep the display where you want it to with algae. So that's how I control algae. I hope you got something good out of this video. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you want to see more, go ahead, hit that subscribe button. I'm going to continue to talk about the status of the aquarium as it goes, and we'll see how my algae mitigation steps continue to work here the next few months. And hey, if something changes or I decide to do something different, I'll probably talk about that in a future video. Thanks again for watching, everybody, and I'll see you on the next video.